Hello, Open XML developers. This is Eric White. Today I am going to give a little tutorial in how to write commandlets in PowerShell script. Now, technically, these are not commandlets. Technically, commandlets are written in C# and these are advanced functions. However, when you get done with writing one of these advanced functions, they look like, they smell like, and they taste like PowerShell commandlets, so that's what I'm going to call them. There are a number of things that you need to know in order to write commandlets in PowerShell script. So this screencast is going to serve as a cheat sheet of sorts to let you know what you need to do in order to write these varieties of commandlets. First thing that we have to do is you need to update your help. If you don't have the most recent version of help, you're operating at a disadvantage, and I'm going to point you at some interesting help information. So in order to update your help, you have to run PowerShell as administrator, and then you can enter the command update help. And if I were to press return here, it would go out on the internet because I have an internet connection, and it would go and download all of that help. I'm not going to do this here. My help is already updated. I am going to show you one of my favorite ways to work with help. This is a little trick that I learned from Jeffrey Snover in one of his Tech Ed sessions. What you want to do is get help *advanced*, and this will show you all of the advanced functions help here, these about functions advanced and about functions advanced methods and so on. And then let's say that you want to get detailed help about the about functions advanced parameters, then get help about functions tab, get to the advanced parameters. I want the full help, and then pipe that into clip. Once you've piped that into clip, start your favorite text editor. I happen to use Notepad++ and paste that in there, and now you have searchable help to go and get all of the information about how to configure parameters to advanced functions. I am going to run PowerShell and put myself into the integrated scripting environment. Truth be told, that's where I live all day long in PowerShell. Control-I puts me in the editor. Control-D takes me back to the command prompt. Control-2 splits me vertically. Control-1 splits me horizontally. Control-3 puts me back into full screen. And Control-D puts me back into the command prompt. So those are the control keys that I use on a regular basis. Control-D, Control-I, Control-1, 2, and 3, depending on how I want to configure my PowerShell integrated scripting environment. I'm changing into the directory oxpt, which is the directory that contains the advanced functions for the Open XML PowerTools module. If you haven't seen the introductory video into version 3.0 of the PowerTools for Open XML, I recommend that you go watch that video before proceeding onwards in this video. It'll explain some of the basic information. I'm not going to repeat that information in this video. The first piece of script that I want to discuss with you is the PSM1 script. This is the oxpt.psm1 script, and this script contains some notes about all of the various commandlets, and it also contains the actual script that kind of gets everything glued together properly. So let's first of all look at the notes about the various commandlets. Up here we have notes about each of the commandlets, such as get, open, XML validation errors, and underneath there I've listed kind of the features that you're going to want to look for in this commandlet. So for instance, the get, open, XML validation errors supports wildcards. So if you need to make a command that supports wildcards, you'll want to look at this commandlet, this script, and you can steal that script directly from there and use it to implement your own support of wildcards in your commandlet. I'll come back and review these various notes about each of these commandlets when we go review the PowerShell script for each of those commandlets. Now let's look at this oxpt.psm1 script a little bit further. We can see here where it dots out into the various other PS1 scripts that make up this module. It dots out into them so that any functions that get declared in those PSM1 scripts, they're available for the whole module, and then eventually are available for this export module member commandlet down here, where we actually tell PowerShell what are the global names that this particular module exports. The first script that this PSM1 script dots out into is this oxpt add types.ps1 script. This is the script that is responsible for adding in the Open XML PowerTools core library, and it makes that core library available to be used in the other PS1 scripts. It also contains examples of writing little bits of C# code that do whatever they need to do, and then we can call those bits of C# code from other PS1 scripts. Let's look at oxpt add types.ps1. In this script, one thing that we do is we define where the Open XML PowerTools DLL is. This is the core C# code that makes up Open XML PowerTools. We define an array of strings that contain all of the assemblies that we need to bind to when we compile C# code here in this module. So for instance, here we have this Open XML validation helper module, and it's standard C# code that does Open XML stuff. One thing is, you'll find it's incredibly inconvenient to attempt to code in this string here and then compile it and find errors and so on. I always just copy this code out. I get it all working in Visual Studio, and then I paste it in here, and I don't actually try to debug any C# code in here. After we've defined the string that contains that C# code, then here we can see we call the add type, passing in the referenced assemblies, and then passing in the source code for this little class that we use. Technically, it's possible to do that functionality up above just using PowerShell itself by using the various features that enable you to new up .NET objects or CLR objects and so on and so forth. But I wanted to do it this way because it's often more convenient to write C# code rather than writing PowerShell script that kind of mimics the C# code. Sometimes it's convenient to do it that way. Sometimes it's convenient to do it the other way. So I put it in here so that you can take your pick as to which approach you need to take. Right up above that is the add type that makes the Open XML PowerTools core DLL available to us. There are two varieties of functionality in this Open XML validation helper. This first one is valid, returns a bool, and that's interesting. There will be times when we want to do something and return a Boolean value or just a scalar type. And also there is another method, this get OpenXML validation errors, that returns a collection. It returns an IEnumerable of validation error info objects. And sometimes you will want to implement certain amounts of OpenXML functionality and then return a collection rather than returning just a single Boolean. So this contains examples of both varieties of approaches that we're going to need to take when we call C# code from our PowerShell scripts. There's also another class down here that enables us to convert to and from base 64 encoded ASCII. I'm going to discuss this C# code and the capability to save to and from base 64 encoded ASCII in another screencast that I'm going to record on the new docx commandlet. One super important point. If you change either the PowerTools for OpenXML DLL or you change the C# code in OXPT add types.ps1, you must exit PowerShell and restart it. The reason why is that in .NET, once you've loaded an assembly, there's no way to get rid of that assembly. So by definition, by the basic behavior of .NET, you have to exit PowerShell and restart it in order to get the new functionality in OXPT add types to come into existence and be available to you from your other PS1 scripts. If you don't change that code, you don't need to do that. If you only change PS1 scripts that are just containing PowerShell scripting, then you can just remove the module and import the module again. Just remember, if you change the C# code, though, you have to exit PowerShell and re-enter it. Let's take as a first example to look at the Mergedocx commandlet. We can see the features we're going to look for. Number one, it calls directly into the Open XML PowerTools core code DLL, and it uses WML document objects in the process of doing so. It shows us how to define aliases. It shows us how to set up an output path parameter, and it shows us how to make a commandlet that returns a WML document. And this enables us to work with documents completely in memory. That's a subject for another screencast. I have it on the list. I'll be putting that together in the near future. Let's go look at that module. One thing to note is that there are kind of two varieties of advanced functions, or two varieties of commandlets that we will use, two distinct varieties. One type just takes a set of arguments, produces some output. That's relatively easy. Another type takes input from the pipeline, and that's very, very slightly more complex to implement. And by very slightly, I mean very, very slightly. There's nothing much to it. One thing to notice here up at the top is we can see the PowerShell comments that give us the help when we type get help Mergedocx. We can set up the synopsis, the description, various examples, and the various parameters. The next thing here is this attribute, this commandlet binding attribute right here. This is important. This actually is what gives this particular function all of its advanced functionality. It's what enables getHelp to go and look at this comment and produce the correct help. It enables things like the verbose parameter and so on and so forth. There's lots of functionality that is magically made available to us by this commandlet binding attribute that is set up here. Another thing to look at here is this is where we can set up a parameter to be mandatory. Now, this isn't technically a feature of advanced functions. This is just a feature of setting up a parameter. You're able to specify that a particular parameter to this function is mandatory. And here we also see where we're specifying an array of .NET objects is the type of this sources parameter. We'll be using this at various places in these commandlets in Open XML PowerTools. We can drop down here. We can see the call to write verbose, and that enables us to specify the -verbose parameter when we call merge-docx commandlet. And we can also see the processing of this output path parameter. If the output path parameter is not equal to string.empty, then later on down here we'll actually save the merged document to output path. Otherwise, this expression $merged WML document, that means that this returns that value. This is the syntax that we use in a function in PowerShell to return an object. We just simply refer to the object as the last thing before we exit the function. And in this case, that'll return the WML object, which is really just a thin wrapper over a byte array that contains the binary form of that object. Last note about looking at merge-docx.ps1 is down here we can see where we call directly into the Open XML PowerTools core code, into the core DLL. We specify the type name as Open XML PowerTools.document builder, and then we use this double colon syntax to get to static methods, and then we call build document passing in the sources, and that's going to return a WML document to us. So that's one of the things that merge-docx.ps1 shows us, is it shows us how to call directly into the Open XML PowerTools DLL directly. Okay, moving on. Let's look at test Open XML valid. One thing that we're going to see in test Open XML valid is it's going to show us how to support wildcards. It's also going to show us how to support piping a collection of files into this commandlet. It's going to show calling a C# function that returns Boolean that was introduced by addType in oxpt addtypes.ps1. It returns a Boolean value, and it also has a set of switch parameters of which we want to enable the end user to only specify one of 3 different parameters. So let's look at that commandlet. Opening up test Open XML valid. We'll skip past all of the documentation. This is more or less the same type of stuff that we saw in the previous commandlet. Again, we can see the commandlet binding parameter that gives us all of the magic functionality. Next thing to look at down here is the file name parameter. This file name parameter, it's a fairly large declaration of this parameter. It has lots of stuff in here. First of all, it tells us that value from pipeline is true. It tells us that it is a mandatory argument. It tells us that we can get the value from pipeline by property name. That enables us to pipe in any collection of objects into this commandlet, and so long as there is a file name property in this collection of objects, the test Open XML valid commandlet will happily process those objects. Here is the validation script. It's a little bit of an interesting animal. One thing that it does is it uses this wildcard pattern class, and it calls the contains wildcard characters method. And if that returns true, then we're going to know that what the user passed was wildcards into this commandlet rather than a specific file name. If that returns false, then we can call test path on that argument. And if test path returns false, then we know we didn't get a valid file name. There's one more point to note here is that whenever you're going to take a file name as an argument, you're going to want to set the environment current directory equal to the location that we get by calling get-location. And the reason why is when we change directory from here to there to elsewhere in a PowerShell command prompt, that doesn't change the current directory. That just changed the current location. And if we refer to a file name with a relative path, it's going to be relative to this current directory. So by setting environment : current directory equal to $ get-location, this makes this commandlet operate the way we expect it to operate. It lets you change directory into a certain directory and type in test-Open XML valid, passing in the name of that file name. So here I'm changing directory into the OXPT examples. If we look at the value of current directory, we can see it's still set to system32 in the Windows folder. So if I were to do test Open XML valid, passing in /valid.docx, and if I didn't have that line in there, then this would not operate properly. It would tell me that C:\Windows /system32 /valid.docx does not exist. That's the import of this line right here. We can also see when we declare this parameter that we tell PowerShell that this parameter supports wildcards. That has some impact on the help, I believe. One thing that we can see, if we look up here, we can see that the documentation indicates that there are 3 parameters: Office 2007, Office 2010, and Office 2013. And we only want to enable the end user to select one of those. This specifies which Office format we're going to validate against. In other words, is it going to be valid for which version of Microsoft Office? We declare the 3 switch parameters like this, but this doesn't prevent us from specifying all 3 of those parameters at once, and that would not be desirable behavior for this commandlet. So right here, there's a little teeny bit of script that if more than one of these is specified, then it throws an error, only one Office version can be specified. That's all there is to it to enable only one of those. We throw some error, and this happens in this begin block right here. Because this is a commandlet that can take input from the pipeline, that's why we have this begin block and this process block. And in the case of the process block, if we are taking input from the pipeline, then the file name parameter will be a collection, and therefore we can for each over each one of those. And again, we look, and if we see that the end user passed in wildcards, then we can process it in this fashion. We actually are just using standard .NET system.io functionality, newing up a directory info and calling get files and running the commandlet over each one of those files, or this for each itself will return multiple files, and we can call the test Open XML valid helper function for that particular file. Here's the little validation helper function, and it calls into the Open XML validation helper class that we defined in the oxpt add types.ps1 module. Next, let's look at the Open XML validation errors module. Very similar to this one, just a couple of minor wrinkles or twists in that module. In this module, the Get Open XML Validation Errors module, there's a lot in common with the test Open XML valid code. For one thing, both of them call into the exact same Open XML Validation Helper class. The difference is that this one calls into a method that returns a collection, whereas the other one returned just a Boolean. Up here we can see all of the code to handle input from the pipeline. That's all the same as in the test OpenXML valid commandlet. The support wildcards capability is the same. The switch parameters that enable the end user to specify either Office 2007, 10, or 13, that's all the same. The one thing that's different about this one, we can see down here at the bottom, which is that we create this hash table, this at curly brace syntax down here, where I indicate some property name equals some expression, semicolon, so on and so forth. This is the syntax to create a hash table, and when the code calls write output, passing in a new object of type PSObject and passes in this -prop parameter with the $output, that then creates a dynamic object with all of those values set. So we can see that we have 7 different properties here. I'll call it on this invalid2.docx, which has multiple errors in that document, and we can see there are our 7 properties. We have the ID, description, part, error type, node, file name, and XPath. This is the pattern that we like to use when we want to return a whole collection of stuff and pass it further down the pipeline. The last commandlet that we're going to look at in detail is this clear docx tracked revision commandlet. We'll find that this uses the exact same pattern for handling input from the pipeline, and it also has the exact same code to handle wildcards. One thing that you'll see up here is In the commandlet binding attribute up here, there are two values that we set. Supports should process equals $true and confirm impact equals medium. And the reason that we set these is that this commandlet actually makes modifications to the target document. Because it makes such modifications, we want to tell people that we're changing something in that document that they pass to it. So there's the support should process and confirm impact equals medium. And what this means is that by default, depending on your settings in PowerShell, it will ask you file by file whether you want to accept tracked revisions on each document. This is the pattern that we should follow when we're actually going in and messing with some document, when we're not just newing up a new document, or when we're not just querying content such as whether the document is valid or not. Down here, a couple small points is that we can see the code that actually calls into the revision acceptor class in the core Open XML PowerTools DLL, and it saves the file and so on and so forth with the same name. One small point down here, we can see where we've put together a couple of aliases for this commandlet. One thing is that accept is not one of the valid verbs. So if I made that be the verb for this commandlet, then you'd get a warning every single time that you import this module. So the appropriate way to do this, we really want to call it accept revision or accept docx tracked revision. The way to do it is use an approved verb for the actual name of this module and then declare some aliases. And then we can look over here in the oxpt.psm1. And down here at the bottom, we can see at this place where we call export module member, we see all of the various public commandlet names as they were, and also the aliases. We export all of those so that when we are at the command line, we can call the method getCommand -module oxpt, and it will return a list of all of the functions and aliases that are exported by this module. Let's do one last little thing. Let's make an innocuous change and show you how you have to remove the module and re-import the module. So if I go into Mergedocx, I am going to make a nonsensical change here. And if I save it and go back here and I type if I were to run this commandlet right now, I wouldn't see those changes. So what I can do is I do remove module oxpt, I import the module oxpt, and I've seen some folks put in force here, and to be honest, I don't know exactly what that does, but it seems like it's a good thing. Let's force the reimportation of that module. And now if I run this example, we can see that test hello world in the verbose output of this module. Remember, if you just change one of the PS1 scripts, it's okay to do this. If you change any of the C# types, you have to exit PowerShell and then go back into PowerShell and then import the module all over again. So the approach to take as you get started writing commandlets is to start with a commandlet that most closely matches what it is that you want to do, and then modify it as appropriate. We are going to see a lot of new commandlets coming up here in the very near future, so come back often to openxmldeveloper.org and follow me on Twitter at EricWhiteDev. Follow Open XML on Twitter at OpenXMLDev. Take care. See you next time.